The wind found the opening before anyone else did. It slid through the valley, low and mean, curling around the stumps and half-built fences, slipping into places a hand couldn't reach. It pushed straight through the missing wall of the widow's cabin and carried the sound of laughter with it. Men's voices from down by the creek, sharp and certain, the kind that only came from people who believed winter was still a rumor. They said she'd gone soft in the head. They said grief had loosened something in her thinking. They said no one survived a mountain winter with a wall missing. By the time the first real snow fell, none of them were laughing anymore. Her name was Ruth Calder, and she had stopped explaining herself weeks ago. Not because she couldn't, but because every explanation sounded thin to people who'd already decided they were right. She'd learned early on that frontier logic was less about proof and more about who had lived long enough to be loud. Widows didn't rank high in that order, especially young ones, and especially not those who built cabins that looked wrong at a glance. The cabin sat just above the valley floor, backed against a rise of packed earth and stone. 3 walls were thick, properly notched, heavy with timber hauled in from the ridge by a mule that had already died of exhaustion before the roof went on. The 4th wall, facing south and slightly downhill, wasn't a wall at all. It was open, framed, yes, braced, but open, save for a set of slats that could be lifted or dropped, and a heavy canvas that could be rolled down like a sail. The first man to comment had done so with a grin and a spit into the dirt. "Wind'll skin you alive come January," he'd said, shaking his head as if pity were the same thing as wisdom. Ruth had nodded once, polite, and gone back to fitting the stones around her hearth. She'd buried her husband the winter before. The ground had been so hard they'd needed fire and iron to break it, and even then the grave came out shallow and crooked. She remembered the way the cold had crept up through her skirts while they worked, how it had settled into her bones long before the snow truly came. She remembered how the old log cabin they'd shared had held the cold like a debt, every fire demanding more wood, every night leaking heat no matter how much they fed the stove. She hadn't forgotten that. She'd built this place because of it. By late autumn, the settlement had mostly finished their own preparations. Roofs were patched, chinks stuffed with moss and clay, wood piles stacked high enough to impress neighbors who mistook volume for security. Men walked the valley with the loose confidence of people who believed they'd already beaten the season simply by surviving the last one. Ruth worked quietly, steadily, never wasting movement. She rose before the sun, her breath fogging the air as she rolled the canvas up to let the morning light pour in. She let the cabin breathe during the day, even when the chill stung her fingers raw. She watched how the sun cut across the floor, how it struck the stone hearth and lingered there longer than it should have. She paid attention to how the wind moved, how it rushed through fast when the slats were high and slowed when they were dropped just enough to force it upward. A few children took to sitting on the slope to watch her. They didn't laugh like their fathers. They just stared, curious, their boots swinging above the frost-stiff grass. One afternoon, a boy asked her why she hadn't finished the wall. Ruth didn't stop working. "Because I don't want it finished," she said. He frowned. "Won't you be cold?" She smiled then, but it wasn't soft. "Not if I'm paying attention." By the time the first warning signs came, geese flying low and silent, the creek slowing under a skin of ice, the valley had already decided what would happen to her. They said she'd come begging once the real cold set in. They said they'd make room if they could. Some said they wouldn't. A few muttered that winter had a way of correcting foolishness without anyone needing to lift a hand. Ruth heard it all. In a small settlement, words traveled faster than weather. The first storm arrived early, not the kind that announced itself with drama, but the kind that crept in overnight and stayed. Snow fell thick and wet, collapsing weak roofs and bending young trees until they split. The temperature dropped fast after sunset, locking everything in place. That night, Ruth did something none of them saw. She lowered the slats halfway. She rolled the canvas down until it kissed the floor but didn't seal it. She lit her fire once. Just once, feeding it until the stone behind it was warm to the touch, then let it die down. She closed the inner shutters that lined the back wall, trapping the heat where it belonged, and went to sleep with the sound of the wind moving through the open face of her cabin, like water through reeds. By morning, frost coated the inside of every other home in the valley. Men woke to stiff blankets and ice-rimmed beards. Women cursed stoves that ate wood like starving animals and still failed to chase the cold from the corners. When someone finally trudged up to Ruth's place, expecting to see her half frozen or gone, they stopped short at the threshold. The ground just inside her cabin wasn't white with frost. It was dry, warm even. No one said anything at first. Pride held their tongues. But something shifted then, subtle and dangerous. The first crack in certainty. Winter hadn't even begun yet. And the valley, whether it knew it or not, was already on the wrong side of it. No one announced what they'd felt when they stepped into Ruth Calder's cabin that morning. Men in the valley had learned to swallow surprise the same way they swallowed fear, quickly and without witnesses. They stood there with snow clinging to their coats, boots creaking as the ice loosened underfoot, and told themselves there had to be a simple explanation, a trick of timing, a lucky fire, anything but the idea that a missing wall had done something their solid cabins could not. Ruth didn't offer an explanation. She poured water from her kettle into a tin cup and watched the steam curl upward, slow and lazy, not snatched away by cold. She saw the way their eyes followed it despite themselves. "You'll want to head back before the trail hardens," she said, not unkindly. "It'll be worse tonight." That was enough to send them away. Concern, when it came from a widow, carried the wrong weight. They left with stiff nods and louder than necessary goodbyes, already rebuilding their certainty as they went. By midday, the talk had shifted again, this time from mockery to dismissal. "Just caught it on a warm spell," someone said. "Stone holds heat," another added, as if the rest of them hadn't also built hearths. "She'll learn," a third concluded. Winter always teaches. Ruth spent that day doing nothing that looked useful to an outsider. She didn't chop wood, she didn't haul water. She sat on a low stool near the open face of her cabin and adjusted the slats inch by inch as the sun moved. When the light struck the stone wall behind her hearth directly, she raised them. When it slipped lower, she dropped them just enough to bend the wind upward instead of letting it rush through. She listened, really listened, to how the air changed pitch when she got it right. That night the temperature fell harder. The creek froze solid by midnight. Trees cracked on the slopes above the valley, sharp reports like rifle shots echoing through the dark. In the settlement, fires burned down to coals faster than they should have, stoves drawing heat up their chimneys and sending it away into the black. People woke coughing from smoke and cold, adjusting dampers and feeding wood until their hands burned and their feet stayed numb. Ruth slept through most of it. She woke once, just before dawn, when the wind shifted and pushed harder against the canvas. She got up, pulled her shawl tight, and rolled the fabric another handspan lower. The air slowed, the sound softened. She went back to bed. By the third day, the valley looked different. Snow no longer sparkled. It dulled, compacted under its own weight, becoming something heavier and meaner. Trails vanished. Fences disappeared into white humps that hid broken rails beneath them. Livestock bawled from barns that were warmer than the open air, but colder than they had any right to be. That was when people began to notice how little smoke rose from Ruth's cabin. At first, it registered as absence rather than presence. Men hauling wood past her place glanced up, confused by the lack of effort it seemed to signal. Smoke meant survival. Everyone knew that. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant life. A cabin without it in this cold should have been silent by now. Instead, Ruth moved in and out of her door with the steady pace of someone unhurried. She carried water without breaking ice inside her bucket. She brought in armfuls of wood that stayed dry, stacked along the back wall where the earth itself lent them its stable cold. Not freezing, not thawing, just held. On the fourth night, a man named Elias Boone woke to find his youngest daughter crying and cold, her breath shallow and fast. His stove had cracked, not split clean, but fractured just enough to leak smoke and draw air the wrong way. He tried to seal it with clay, then with ash, then with his bare hands until his fingers bled and the fire guttered anyway. By dawn, he had no choice left that pride could justify. He wrapped the girl in blankets and set out through the snow, following the slope toward Ruth's place, with the kind of urgency that left no room for embarrassment. His boots slipped, his breath burned. When he reached the open face of her cabin, he stopped short again, just like the others had. Warmth met him before words did. It wasn't the sharp, stinging heat of a roaring fire. It was even, held, the kind that settled into joints instead of rushing past skin. His daughter stopped crying almost immediately, her body relaxing against his chest. Ruth looked up from where she was kneeling near the hearth, adjusting stones that had shifted with the freeze. "Bring her in," she said. "You're letting the cold pile up behind you." He obeyed without thinking, stepping fully inside and feeling the difference deepen around him. Only then did he notice the fire, or rather the lack of one. Embers glowed faintly, banked low. The stone behind them radiated warmth like it remembered something the air did not. "How?" he asked finally, the word torn out of him by exhaustion more than curiosity. Ruth didn't answer right away. She finished what she was doing, then stood and pulled the canvas down another notch as the light shifted outside. "I let the cold move," she said at last. "I don't fight it head on." Elias frowned, trying to fit that into the lessons he'd grown up with. "Fight the cold, beat it back, burn hotter, stack more wood." She handed him a cup of water. It wasn't steaming, but it wasn't rimmed with ice either. "The wind steals heat when it rushes," she went on, "so I slow it. The sun gives heat when it stays, so I trap it where it lands. The ground keeps a steady temperature furniture all year if you don't break it open. I built around that instead of pretending I could outwork winter." He looked around, really looked, and began to see the pattern. The way the open face angled slightly, never square to the prevailing wind. The way the stone floor sloped just enough to catch light and hold it. The thickness of the back wall, packed with earth and timber, sealing in what the front carefully controlled. Word spread fast after that, but not cleanly. Some said she'd stumbled into luck. Others said she'd been taught by someone who knew more than they did. A few, quieter voices began to ask harder questions about why their own cabins bled heat no matter how much wood they burned, about why smoke and fire had become a kind of superstition instead of a tool. Winter answered those questions one by one. Another storm rolled in before the valley could catch its breath. This one came with wind that tore at roofs and drove snow sideways, packing it into cracks and seams until doors froze shut from the inside. People burned through half their wood in a single night, watching helplessly as the cold crept back in by morning. Ruth opened her slats wider. The wind rushed through, yes, but slowed, redirected, lifted. It never touched the core of her cabin. The air that left took dampness with it, carrying away the chill that came from trapped moisture. She rolled the canvas down only when the sun dropped, sealing in what the stone had gathered all day. By the end of the week, no one laughed anymore. They came quietly now, one by one at first, then in pairs. Not all of them asked to stay. Some only stood in her doorway, feeling the difference, trying to memorize it without admitting they didn't understand. Ruth answered questions when they were asked honestly. She turned away no one in danger, but she never let anyone pretend this was an accident. Winter was still tightening its grip on the valley, and it hadn't yet shown them how far it intended to go. The cold deepened in layers, not all at once, and that was what made it dangerous. By the time the valley realized the season had crossed a line, they were already standing on the wrong side of it. Snow no longer melted at the edges during the day. It compacted, hardened, and turned treacherous underfoot. Paths became guesses, distances stretched. The valley floor, once open and familiar, became a white basin that swallowed sound and scale alike. Ruth Calder measured the change the way she always did, not by the calendar or the look of the sky, but by how the air moved inside her cabin. The wind no longer sang when it passed through the slats. It pressed, heavy, dense. It carried a cold that wasn't sharp, but absolute, the kind that erased warmth instead of competing with it. She adjusted her canvas earlier each evening now, sealing the cabin before the light fully left the slope. She fed her fire longer but not hotter, letting the stone behind it soak in the heat instead of chasing flames up the chimney. She had expected this. What she hadn't expected was how quickly the rest of the valley would unravel. The first death came quietly. An older man who lived alone near the tree line failed to show up one morning to check his traps. By the time someone went looking, the snow had already drifted over his door. They found him seated near his stove, wood stacked beside him, eyes closed as if he'd simply sat down to rest and forgotten to get back up. His cabin smelled of smoke and cold iron. After that, the nights grew louder. People woke to the sound of wood splitting as trees burst under the strain of frozen sap. Livestock screamed in barns where breath turned to frost on hides and feed froze solid in troughs. Stoves cracked, chimneys clogged, fires burned too hot and then too low, swinging between extremes that left bodies exhausted and homes damp with trapped cold. And still, Ruth's cabin held. She had taken Elias Boone's daughter in for 3 nights before his repairs held. Then another child came, then a woman whose hands had gone numb trying to break ice inside her own home. Ruth rearranged her space without ceremony, rolling bedrolls tighter, shifting storage, opening the slats a fraction more during the day to purge moisture as bodies filled the room. She never said yes out loud. She simply didn't say no. By the second week of hard cold, people began to understand something they hadn't wanted to before. The problem wasn't that Ruth's cabin was unfinished. It was that theirs were. Men gathered in low voices near failing fires, asking questions they should have asked months earlier. Why did the cold feel worse inside than out some nights? Why did their walls sweat and then freeze? Why did burning more wood seem to make things worse by morning? A few tried to imitate her design outright. One man tore boards from his south wall in a panic, only to discover too late that direction mattered, angle mattered, control mattered. His house bled heat faster than before, and he boarded it back up in shame. Ruth heard about it and said nothing. On the 15th night, the storm that would decide the valley arrived. It came in from the north, dragging wind down from higher elevations where snow had already buried entire stands of timber. The air pressure dropped fast. Animals sensed it first, horses refusing feed, dogs whining and circling. By dusk, the sky had flattened into a hard metallic grey that swallowed distance and color alike. Ruth finished her preparations before the first flakes fell. She cleared the open face of her cabin completely, raising the slats high and tying back the canvas while there was still light. She built her fire carefully, feeding it until the stone wall behind it radiated a deep, steady warmth. Then she let it burn down, banking the embers low. She sealed the rear shutters, checked the floor stones for gaps, and stacked dry wood within arm's reach, but no closer than needed. When the first gust hit, it struck like a blow. Snow drove sideways, slamming into the slope and rebounding in chaotic swirls. Wind screamed through the valley, tearing loose boards from roofs and flinging them into the dark. Somewhere below, something collapsed with a sound like thunder. Inside Ruth's cabin, the air moved fast, but not violently. The wind rushed in, met resistance, and rose. Moisture lifted with it, carried out through the upper gaps instead of settling into breath and cloth. The stone floor stayed dry. The back wall held its warmth. The heat she'd stored earlier bled out slowly, evenly, without flame. People began arriving before midnight. Some came with children bundled against their chests. Others came alone, faces drawn tight with fear they could no longer hide. They didn't knock. The storm made knocking pointless. They stepped into the open face of her cabin and stopped, stunned, as warmth wrapped around them, like something alive. Ruth moved among them with quiet authority, guiding them where to sit, where to lie down, when to drink, when to rest. She opened the slats wider as bodies filled the space, keeping the air fresh without letting the cold pool. She never let the fire roar. She never sealed the opening completely. Outside, the valley disappeared. By morning, visibility dropped to nothing. Snow filled every hollow, erased every marker. Cabins vanished beneath drifts that climbed their walls and pressed against roofs. Doors froze shut. Chimneys choked. Inside those sealed spaces, air grew stale and damp, and cold crept back in with a patience that no amount of wood could outrun. Ruth's cabin breathed. People listened to the storm tear itself apart against the slope and whispered prayers they hadn't spoken in years. A few cried quietly. Some slept for the first time in days. Children sprawled near the stone wall, cheeks flushed with warmth instead of fever. No one mocked her now. When the wind finally began to weaken, when it fell from a scream to a howl to a constant grinding push, Ruth stepped to the open face of her cabin and looked out over a valley that no longer resembled the place she'd known. Snow lay piled against structures like frozen waves. Roof lines sagged. Smoke no longer rose from most chimneys. People understood then, in the aftermath, that this wasn't about cleverness or luck. Winter hadn't been beaten. It had been respected, and the cost of misunderstanding that was now written across the valley in silence and snow. When the storm finally loosened its grip, it didn't leave all at once. It withdrew the way a predator does, slowly, watching, daring perceived safety to invite mistakes. The wind dropped first, sinking into a low, constant pressure that pressed against walls and lungs alike. Snow still fell, but straight now, heavy and quiet, stacking itself without sound. The valley lay buried under it, reshaped into something unfamiliar and hostile. No one rushed outside. Those who had spent the night in Ruth Calder's cabin waited, listening, unsure whether the silence meant relief or another trick. Cold had a way of pretending it was finished before returning sharper than before. People had learned that lesson the hard way. Ruth was the first to move. She loosened the canvas just enough to let fresh air roll through, then raised the slats gradually, testing how the cabin responded. The warmth held. The stone gave back what it had stored. Condensation never had a chance to settle. She nodded to herself, then turned to the others. "Not yet," she said, when a man reached for his coat. "Give it time to finish what it started." They listened. That alone would have seemed impossible a month earlier. When they did step out, hours later, the damage revealed itself in stages. A barn roof crushed inward, beams split under the weight of drifted snow. A cabin half collapsed where fire had melted the underside of a drift, refreezing it into a solid mass that tore the structure apart as it shifted. Chimneys lay snapped near their bases, sheared clean where heat and cold had fought until stone gave way. Some homes looked intact from a distance but were dead inside. Fires had suffocated. Air had grown stale. Moisture had frozen in layers along the walls, turning livable space into a trap. They found survivors moving slowly, stunned, wrapped in whatever they'd had left. They found others too still to help. Ruth didn't go with the first search parties. She stayed behind, tending those who had taken shelter with her, until they were strong enough to move on their own. Frostbitten fingers were warmed carefully, slowly. Lungs strained by smoke and cold were given rest and clean air. She rationed food without ceremony, stretching what she had without turning it into spectacle. By the second day after the storm, the valley began to gather itself around her cabin, not in crowds, but in purpose. Men came asking questions they had once mocked. Not, "Why did you do this?" but "How does it work?" Ruth answered when the questions came honestly. She walked them through the space, pointing out details she'd never hidden. The angle of the opening, the reason the slats weren't straight, the way the stone hearth wasn't just a place for fire, but a battery for heat, the importance of letting air move instead of sealing it tight. "You trap moisture, you trap cold," she told them. "You fight wind head-on. It finds the cracks and takes more than you can spare." Some nodded, some frowned. Understanding didn't come easily to people who had survived by stubbornness alone, but winter had thinned the ground beneath certainty. There wasn't much left to stand on. A few tried to argue. They talked about tradition, about how things had always been done. Ruth listened, then gestured toward the valley, toward the broken roofs, the collapsed chimneys, the graves already being marked in frozen ground. "This winter didn't care how things were done before," she said. "It only cared what worked." That ended the arguments. They began making changes where they could, not tearing walls down in panic now, but opening them carefully, adjusting angles, building windbreaks instead of barriers. They piled earth against the north sides of their homes. They thickened back walls and learned to let the south breathe during daylight hours. It was too late for some. Winter had already taken what it would take, but for others the change meant survival through the long weeks that followed. Ruth never claimed credit. When someone called her clever, she shook her head. When someone thanked her for saving their children, she accepted it quietly and turned back to work. She refused offers to move into larger homes or take a place of authority she hadn't asked for. Her cabin remained what it had always been, open, controlled, unassuming. By late winter, the mocking tone that had once followed her name was gone entirely. In its place was something heavier. Respect, yes, but also unease. People didn't like being reminded that survival didn't always come from strength or noise. They didn't like knowing they'd been wrong when the cost of being right had been lives. Spring would come eventually. Everyone knew that. But spring didn't erase memory. When the first thaw finally began, when water started to move again beneath the ice and roofs began to drip, people stood in the valley and looked at the land with different eyes. They saw how cold pooled, how wind carved paths, how sun lingered where it was allowed to. They saw, finally, what Ruth had been watching all along, and they understood that the missing wall had never been absence. It had been intention. Spring arrived the way it always did in the valley, unevenly, without apology, and far later than anyone wanted. It crept down from the ridges, in thin streams of meltwater that cut through snow like quiet knives. Roofs dripped by day and refroze by night. The ground softened just enough to remind people how much weight winter had pressed into it. What winter left behind could not be melted away so easily. The dead were buried first. There was no ceremony beyond what the cold allowed. Graves were dug where the earth would give, marked with stones hauled from thawing slopes. Names were spoken softly, sometimes not at all. Everyone understood that words did little good against what had already happened. Only after that did the valley begin to take stock. Cabins were opened and emptied, their interiors examined with new attention. People noticed patterns they had ignored before. Dark stains where moisture had gathered and frozen. Warped boards where heat had rushed upward and escaped. Thick frost lines along walls that should have protected them. Chimneys were rebuilt shorter. Roof lines were altered to shed snow instead of collecting it. Doors were moved, angled, shielded, and everywhere, in small but unmistakable ways, the influence of Ruth Calder's cabin spread. No one copied it exactly. Pride wouldn't allow that, but they borrowed from it. Openings were cut on the southern sides of homes, framed carefully, given slats instead of shutters. Canvas appeared where none had been before, treated and reinforced, something between a wall and a door. Stone hearths were rebuilt deeper into homes, backed with mass instead of left exposed. Earth was packed where air had once rushed freely. People talked less while they worked. They remembered the sound of winter too well. Ruth took no part in directing these changes. She helped when asked, lent tools when needed, answered questions honestly, but she never told anyone what to do. She had learned long before the storm that knowledge forced onto unwilling hands only bred resentment. What stuck was what had been earned. Her cabin changed too, though not in the way some expected. She didn't add the missing wall. Instead, she refined what was already there. She replaced slats that had warped under strain adjusted angles that had proven less efficient under extreme wind, deepened the stone along the back wall to hold heat longer through the night. The design remained open, controlled, deliberate. One afternoon, as the valley thawed enough for people to move freely again, a small group gathered near her cabin without quite meaning to. They stood looking at it the way they once had, with amusement, then disbelief, then fear. Now they looked with something closer to humility. A man cleared his throat. "You could have told us sooner," he said, not accusingly, but with the dull honesty of hindsight. Ruth didn't turn from where she was stacking stones. "I did," she said. "You just didn't like the answer." No one argued with that. By late spring, the valley no longer looked like a place that had barely survived. Repairs smoothed the worst scars. New fences went up, livestock returned to pasture, children ran again without being bundled into silence. But something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be rebuilt or forgotten. People watched the weather now. They noticed how wind moved through the valley instead of assuming it would behave. They paid attention to where snow lingered longest, where frost struck hardest, where sunlight pooled and stayed. Winter had taught them that ignorance wasn't neutral, it was dangerous. Ruth became part of the landscape in a way she never had before. Not a leader, not a legend, just a presence that people measured themselves against when making decisions. When summer came in full, someone joked, carelessly, without malice, that she ought to finish her wall now that the danger had passed. Ruth smiled, brief and distant. "Oh, danger doesn't pass," she said. "It waits." She left the wall open. The following autumn, new settlers arrived, drawn by word of fertile ground and a valley that had endured what should have broken it. They walked the settlement with the wide-eyed confidence of people who hadn't yet been tested. Some laughed when they saw Ruth's cabin, not cruelly, not the way the others once had, just lightly, dismissively, the way people do when they believe they already understand the world. The valley didn't correct them. It didn't need to. Winter would come again. It always did, and when it did, the lesson would already be standing there on the slope, quiet, unremarkable, and open to the wind. The missing wall was still there, not as a flaw, but as a reminder. Years later, people still argued about the winter. Not about how cold it had been. That part was settled. Everyone agreed it had been the worst they could remember, the kind of season that redrew the line between survival and luck. What they argued about was why some things had failed so completely while others had endured. Newcomers heard the stories secondhand, softened by repetition. They were told about snow that buried cabins to their eaves, about winds that tore roofs loose and drove drifts sideways through cracks no one had known were there. They heard about people who'd burned through whole wood piles in weeks and still froze, about livestock lost inside barns meant to protect them, and always eventually they heard about the widow. The story changed depending on who told it. Some said she'd been taught by someone back east. Some said she'd read about strange building methods before ever coming west. A few, quieter voices insisted there was nothing mysterious about it at all, that she'd simply paid attention when others hadn't. Ruth Calder never corrected any of them. Time passed, the way it always does on the frontier, unevenly, carried forward by work more than by memory. Children grew, old men died, new cabins went up, different in small but meaningful ways from the ones that had failed before. Openings were placed more carefully, stone was used where it mattered. People stopped sealing themselves into boxes and started thinking in terms of flow, of air, of heat, of cold. They didn't talk about Ruth as much as they used to. They didn't need to. Her cabin remained where it had always been, weathered now, its timbers darkened by sun and seasons. The missing wall was still missing, though it looked less strange with every passing year. Canvas had been replaced and reinforced more than once. Slats bore the marks of long use, notched and smoothed by hands that understood them. Children who had once slept on her floor during the storm grew up and built homes of their own. Without ever saying why, they angled doors away from the wind. They let their houses breathe during the day. They trusted stone and earth to do work fire could not. Ruth aged quietly. Her hair grayed early. Her hands thickened with time and labor. She never remarried. She never left the valley. She spent her days much as she always had, watching the light, feeling the air, making small adjustments that kept her space balanced against whatever the season decided to bring. When she died, it was not during a storm. It was late autumn. The air was sharp but fair. The slats were raised to catch the last warmth of the sun. The canvas rolled neatly above the opening. She was found seated near the hearth, the stone still warm from a fire she had let burn down properly. They buried her on the rise behind her cabin, where the ground drained well and the wind never lingered too long. There was no grand marker, just a slab of local stone set upright, its face left uncarved. Anyone who needed to know could ask. Anyone who didn't would still feel the place was important without being told why. The cabin was not torn down. For a while, No one knew what to do with it. Some suggested finishing the wall at last, turning it into something more conventional. Others argued it should be left exactly as it was. In the end, it was left alone, not out of reverence, but because altering it felt wrong in a way no one could quite explain. Winters continued to come. Some were mild, some were not. But the valley no longer panicked at the first hard freeze. People prepared differently now. They watched instead of assuming. They adjusted instead of resisting. They remembered even if they no longer spoke about it. And every year, without fail, when the first real cold settled in and the wind began to move low through the basin, someone, usually a newcomer, would stop in front of Ruth Calder's old cabin and ask the same question. Why did she leave that wall open? No one ever gave the same answer, but the wind, moving through the opening, just as it always had, carried one all the same. Because winter was never something to be shut out, only something to be understood.